Hello and welcome to another Tri-tutors video. In today's video we're going to be focusing on part 2 of the novel Life of Pi, particularly Pi's time as a castaway. And so I've split this part 2 into 4 different sections, and today we're going to work on the first section, which are the characters. So the way that we're going to go through it is just like we did part 1. I've collected some quotes which I think are important to know if you're planning to write an essay on Life of Pi, and we're going to discuss some of those quotes. So we're not really talking about the plot, we're more talking about the characters themselves and how they link to potential themes and fundamental questions. So definitely you have to read the novel first, and then you can watch this video to sort of get an analysis or insight into these characters that pop up in Pi's time as a castaway. So firstly, I've grouped together the 3 animals that don't really last too long right at the start of part 2. So the zebra being first. The zebra was being eaten alive from the inside, so recall sort of the plot line of that story. And I think the use of the zebra, or the storyline of the zebra, just alerts Pi to the fact that he's sort of in this animalistic world now, and he has to fend for himself, and he sees the zebra. And something he notices, which I think I've put later on under my section on Pi, but I think this very barbaric thing that he sees of the zebra being eaten from the inside out is really traumatizing. But something that Pi says is that it would have been more traumatizing if he had not been experiencing trauma at the same time. So he couldn't have too much empathy for the zebra because he was struggling himself to survive. So that's an interesting thing about perspective. Then we have the hyena. This is a really interesting one because initially Pi is really afraid of this hyena because he doesn't realize that the tiger is there. He doesn't realize that Richard Parker's there. And so his whole perspective once again is shifts between when he realizes that Richard Parker is there, he completely then is not afraid of the hyena. I was no longer afraid of it. So beforehand, this is like the sort of alpha predator on board. Well, that's what Pi thinks until he realizes Richard Parker's there. So when he realizes the tiger is there, I was no longer afraid of it. To be afraid of this ridiculous dog when there was a tiger about was like being afraid of splinters when trees are falling down. So there's a nice little simile to describe that. The hyena died neither whining nor whimpering, and Richard Parker killed without a sound. So that's the hyena's demise. Orange juice. This is maybe the most interesting of these 3 because orange juice is an animal that Pi knows, and he remembers from her time at the zoo. He knows her whole story, and also because of orangutans' likeness to humans, he feels a lot of empathy towards her. She remained gentle and unaggressive her whole life. All my life I had known only a part of her. And this he talks about when the orangutan goes and fights the hyena. He had only known this part of her as being unaggressive, but then he sees sort of this other side to her. An orangutan may be taller, may have very strong and agile arms and long canines, but if it doesn't know how to use these as weapons, they are of little use. The hyena, with only its jaws, will overcome the ape because it knows what it wants and how to get it. To the end, she reminded me of us. Her eyes expressed fear in such a human-like way, as did her strained whimpers. So I think that of all of these animals, the orange juice or the orangutan really is, an important loss that Pi experiences that impacts him later on in the novel. Okay, then we need to talk about Pi, and I've specifically labeled this Pi's mindset because obviously we're going to discuss Pi in every single part. We discussed him in part 1, what we know about him, and here I'm just quoted a bunch of the things that are going through his head as he's going through part 2 and what his mindset is. And a lot of this has to do with his survival mindset, but also you're going to see the difference between, or the way that he balances hope and reason, or faith and rationality. And that's a very important theme which I'm definitely going to discuss when we get to the themes video, but we can see it in his mindset as well. And this is why Pi is so successful why he is successful and why he survives, is because he combines these 2 ideas. If he had just had faith, then he probably wouldn't have survived. If he had just had reason, he also probably wouldn't have survived. So putting them together is what actually sets him apart and allows him to survive. Things didn't turn out the way they were supposed to, but what can you do? You must take life the way it comes at you and make the best of it. I mean, I think this is a very big understatement. If I remember correctly, this is right at the end of part 1, just before we get to part 2. And Pi basically says his life didn't turn out exactly how he wanted, which I think would be an understatement because his whole life has been turned around. It was shock inactivity. Something in me did not want to give up on life, was unwilling to let go, wanted to fight until the very end. So this is when he's initially, cast away, and he doesn't really know why he's fighting to live, but there's just something innate within him that I think we all really have, is that not to give up and to try and to survive. No matter the odds, you try to survive. I only had to ensure my survival for the next few hours until the rescue ship came. This is really important for his mindset, because early on, the initial few days, the reason why Pi survives is because he has hope, because he thinks that there's going to be a ship that's come save him. He thinks that someone knows that he's there, and that's what keeps him going. And that's going to be a major turning point and a major change, or a major indicator of Pi's transformation, is when he actually decides, or he recognizes and realizes, oh, no one's coming to save me. If I want to live, I've got to have to survive myself. So that's a big shift. But the first few days, he thinks that he's going to be rescued. I will beat the odds, as great as they are. I have survived so far, miraculously. Now I will turn miracle into routine. The amazing will be seen every day. I will put all the work necessary. Yes, so long as God is with me, I will not die. I discovered at that moment that I had a fierce will to live. I was feeling faint with fear. A tiger abroad, and I had waited 3 days and 3 nights to save my life. So these last 2 quotes I feel like are really important, because I think if you look at Pi, or if you just read a summary of the story, you're like, oh wow, Pi was really brave and he was fearless. But that's not true. I think why Pi is such an interesting character is because he's really human. And I think we spoke about that in the previous video as well, with his take on religion and atheism, and how we go to the lengths that we can, and then we of reason, and then we take the leap. And here the same sort of thing is, he's not fearless. He does feel fear. He's berates himself. He hasn't done anything about this tiger for 3 days and 3 nights. He is fearful, but he deals with that fear, and that's what ensures his survival. Every hair on me was standing up, shrieking with fear. The raft business was far too precarious. It only needed a shark to bite the rope, or a knot to become undone, or a large wave to crash upon me, and I would be lost. So you see, he is paranoid, he is fearful, but he deals with that, and he still acts. My options were limited to perching above a tiger or hovering over sharks. So this really emphasizes his situation, his precarious situation. Barely grateful to be still alive. It was Richard Parker who calmed me down. It is the irony of the story that the one who scares me witless to start with was the very same who brought me peace, purpose, I dare say even wholeness. This is such an important quote, because it is so important to the fundamental theme and what this is all about. And it's essentially saying to us that and the irony is when it's the opposite of what is expected occurs. So you would expect the tiger to impede his survival, but actually having the tiger on board allows Pi to survive, because it gives him purpose, it gives him something to do and something to worry about, as opposed to the other things that he could have been worrying about if he didn't have Richard Parker. And it cures his loneliness. So that is the irony of the story, is that Richard Parker is actually key to his survival, not a threat to his survival. I will tell you a secret. A part of me was glad about Richard Parker. A part of me did not want Richard Parker to die at all, because if he died, I would be left alone with despair, a foe even more formidable than a tiger. If I still had the will to live, it was thanks to Richard Parker. He kept me from thinking too much about my family and my tragic circumstances. He pushed me to go on living. I hated him for it, yet at the same time I was grateful. I am grateful. It's the plain truth. Without Richard Parker, I wouldn't be alive today to tell you my story. I had to stop hoping so much that a ship would rescue me. I should not count on outside help. Survival had to start with me. In my experience, a castaway's worst mistake is to hope too much and do too little. Survival starts by paying attention to what is close at hand and immediate. To look out with idle hope is tantamount to dreaming one's life away. So this is what I spoke about earlier, about this transformation, about this shift. He realizes, okay, now I actually have to ensure my own survival. No one's going to help me. There was much I had to do. I looked at the empty horizon. There was so much water, and I was all alone, all alone. I burst into hot tears. I buried my face in my crossed arms and sobbed. My situation was patently hopeless. Once again, the humanness of Pi's character really allows us to connect with him. With just one glance, I discovered that the sea is a city just below me, all around, unsuspected by me, where highways, boulevards, streets and roundabouts bustling with submarine traffic. And this is something really powerful about Pi, is how he notices things and how he makes comments about them, and he's in a very sort of mature way. And he comments here on how the ocean, he's actually not alone. This is this entire city beneath him. He just never realized it before. And maybe human beings don't realize it because we just sort of go on the ocean just to get from A to B. And he's saying, wow, it's actually incredible. There's so many things going on. There's so much wildlife, so many interesting things beneath the water. What delusion was I under that I thought I could outwit him? Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Okay, sorry, I skipped ahead there. The first quote, this is when he's sort of doubting his stance on Richard Parker, and when we get to discussing Richard Parker, we'll chat about how he goes about training him and what his thoughts are in doing that. But he does second guess himself. And then the next few quotes, let's just read them through, and these talk about his first time fishing. Several times I started bringing the hatchet down, but I couldn't complete the action. Tears flowing down my cheeks, I egged myself on. I wept heartily over this poor little deceased soul. It was the first sentient being I had ever killed. I was now a killer. I was as guilty as Cain. I was 16 years old, a harmless boy, bookish and religious, and now I had blood on my hands. It's a terrible burden to carry. All sentient life is sacred. I'll never forget to include this fish in my prayers. Now that it was dead, the flying fish looked like fish I'd seen the markers upon a cherry. It was something else, something outside the essential scheme of creation. So for Pi, to kill this fish, this first fish, is a really big deal because he is vegetarian, he's a pacifist, right? So he hates any sort of violence, and it's really difficult for him. And the irony is that he takes so long to kill this fish that he actually prolongs the fish's trouble and suffering more than he has to. And the fact that he still thinks about it to this day really shows how sensitive he is and how, how committed he is to his values. And even though he recognizes in this moment he has to kill the fish because otherwise he will not survive, even looking back on it, he retains those values of vegetarianism and of, peace all the way when he's done with his survival. He keeps those same values when he's older. A person can get used to anything, even to killing. Isn't that such a powerful statement? I survived 227 days. That's how long my trial lasted, over 7 months. I kept myself busy. That was one key to my survival. On a lifeboat, even on a raft, there's always something that needs doing. Mornings were usually better than the late afternoons, when the emptiness of time tended to make itself felt. So this is really insignificant. Well, it is really significant because this shows us how he survived as well. And what he does is he creates a routine for himself. He makes sure that he stays busy. He makes sure that he has something to do. And in that way, he doesn't think about his trauma the whole time or think about all the terrible things. And so this is also, remember I spoke about reason and rationality being important. And this is something that he realizes that he needs to keep busy in order to stay sane and to survive. And that's what he does. But there were more to my dealings with him than strictly necessary. I also spent hours observing him because it was a distraction. So here talk about Richard Parker and how he helps him not just, he doesn't just threaten him, he actually helps him. He's a distraction. Pi watches him. My story started on a calendar day, July 2nd, 1977, and ended on a calendar day, February 14th, 1978. But in between there was no calendar. I did not count the days or the weeks or the months. Time is an illusion that only makes us pant. I survived because I forgot even the very notion of time. This is so important because we're going to talk about how Pi transforms to become more like Savage as he goes longer and longer, being away from civilized society and being on the ocean with a tiger. And this is really interesting about time itself. And time is a construct, right? It's something that we humans have created to feel sort of in control. But when you're out on the water with no hope of survival or of being rescued, time sort of falls away. It's also significant because it points to whether the story is actually true almost, because it's all his recollections, but it's not like he actually knew the date. So we don't actually know how far into the journey things happen, or if it's exactly this and this day, or how long it took before he realized this and this thing, because it is his memory. What I remember are events and encounters and routines, markers that emerged here and there from the ocean of time and imprinted themselves on my memory. My memories come in a jumble. So here talking about his memories and how the story that we're reading, as much as we want to believe every word of it, maybe he's focused too much on one thing and left out another thing because it's just using his memories. He didn't have any notion of time while he was alone in the middle of the Pacific. My greatest wish, other than salvation, was to have a book, a long book with a never-ending story, one I could read again and again, with new eyes and a fresh understanding each time. So he was bored. Words scratched on a page trying to capture reality that overwhelmed me. So he does find this notebook and he tries to write things down. But as he says, it's like an indescribable experience. So to trying to like put what he's feeling and put what he's doing and what his situation is down on paper is really difficult. The rain chilled me to the bone, but I was smiling. I remember that close encounter with electrocution and third-degree burns as one of the few times during my ordeal where I felt genuine happiness. So this is speaking about a moment of danger, and we could talk about later in the themes video about how he remarks how like death is something that actually keeps you going and keeps you sort of excited about life. And that's a really interesting idea, because in that moment he feels the most alive because he's escaped death yet again. At moments of wonder, it is easy to avoid small thinking, to entertain thoughts that span the universe. We perished away. It happened slowly, so that I didn't notice it all the time. So now we're going into the sort of latter part when him and Richard Parker are really struggling. And this is when they're going to encounter the blind Frenchman, because at this point both Richard Parker and Pi have become extremely weakened by their ordeal. And Pi does have moments where he really does lose hope. It's no use. Today I die. I will die today. I die. This was the last entry. I went on from there, endured, but without noting it. Do you see these invisible spirals on the margins of the page? I thought I would run out of paper. It was the pens that ran out. Such a powerful statement. He's written down, and he kept thinking he's going to run out of space, he's going to run out of pages, so he's been writing in the margins, but something unexpected happens. He ran out of his pen. And isn't that like the story of his whole thing? He thought he was going to Canada with his family, landed up being a castaway for over 200 days on the Pacific Ocean. By the next morning, I'd lost all fear of death, and I resolved to die. So you can see the hopelessness, the idea of he starts off with this fierce will to live, but this journey takes its toll on him and on his mental health as well, and his sanity. The rest of the story is nothing but grief, ache, and endurance. So that's an understanding of the last part of the journey being extremely difficult. And as much as the first part of the journey he was dealing with loss, the second part of the journey is also difficult. He is extremely weak and exhausted from this ordeal, both physically and mentally. Okay, so now let's talk about Richard Parker, really important character. The hunter, whose name was Richard Parker, so that's how Richard Parker got his name, because it does sound like a human's name, because it is. There was a mix-up on the paperwork. He took up over a third of the length of the ship he was on. So that really shows us what Pi is dealing with, a really, really huge animal on this lifeboat, and a dangerous one at that. And the reason why he hasn't been but he didn't bug Pi for the first 3 days is this combination of sedation and seasickness. He was incredibly muscular, incomparably beautiful. So this is Pi noticing him and sort of assessing the situation. And then this is when Pi has all these thoughts. And he thinks to himself, how is he going to get rid of Richard Parker? What are the different ideas? And he goes through all these different ideas of how he can possibly get rid of him. And every time he tries one, he comes with a comeback of like he has a conversation in his head. It's like, oh shoot, no, that won't work. Oh no, this won't work. And then he eventually, let's actually read it, and then I'll tell you what he eventually settles on. Push him off the lifeboat. Then he thinks, hold on, tigers are accomplished swimmers. Kill him with the 6 morphine syringes. And then he's like, hold on, is that going to actually do anything to him? Or is he just going to knock him out for a little bit? Attack him with all available weaponry. And then he's like, hold on, for if there's one thing that's more dangerous than a healthy animal, it's an injured animal. Then he has these ideas to choke him, poison him, set him on fire, electrocute him. But he realizes that none of those are actually feasible. He can't actually kill the tiger that way. He doesn't have those tools, and it would be too dangerous. And then he decides on waging a war of attrition. All I had to do was let the unforgiving laws of nature run their course, and I would be saved. And This is his thoughts, and he continues, but no animal, however mighty, can do without water for an extended period of time. And then he realizes, no, hold on, this sort of tiger, they're known to drink saline water, so that's not going to work. And then Pi realizes the next day that the only thing he's going to do, the plan he has to go on, is plan number 7, to keep him alive. And he recognizes that he needs to train Richard Parker, and the only way for him to sort of be safe with Richard Parker is to actually keep him alive. He backed off and dropped to the bottom of the boat. The first training session was over. It was a resounding success. I stopped whistling and sat down heavily on the raft, out of breath and exhausted. And so it came to be. Plan number 7, keep him alive. What a stunning creature. With feline speed, he had leapt across the lifeboat and struck me. It was right I needed, the sort of rights that came with might. It was time to impose myself and carve out my territory. So now he's going to really make sure that he trains Richard Parker properly, and he uses all his knowledge that we discussed in part 1 to assist him. Obviously, he's never done this before, but he uses that sort of knowledge. And something to notice why he needs to carve out territory is because he's built this raft that attaches to the lifeboat, but the raft is a lot more flimsy, and he recognizes that there's going to come a point when the weather's bad or something happens, and he's going to have to go onto the lifeboat where Richard Parker is. And he needs to make sure that Richard Parker is obviously not going to attack him when that time comes, that he will stay on his side of the lifeboat. So he needs to carve out his territory on the lifeboat, so when he needs to, he can climb aboard. Be sure not to break eye contact. Once your animal has trespassed upon your territory, be unflagging in your outrage. Treatment should be repeated until the association in the animal's mind between the sound of the whistle, the feeling of intense incapacitating nausea, is fixed and totally unambiguous. Tigers, indeed all animals, do not favor violence as a means of settling scores. When animals fight, it was the intent to kill, and with the understanding that they might be killed. A clash is costly. So here he sort of presents it as though he's giving an instruction manual on how to train an animal, which is quite humorous. And he basically tells us how he's conditioning Richard Parker into not going into Pi's territory, into staying in his place. And he says that tigers do not automatically want to engage in fights, but they do that sort of as a last resort. 4 times he struck me with his right paw and sent me overboard, and 4 times I lost my shield. Eventually I learned to read the signals he was sending me. My 5th shield lasted me the rest of his training. It was not good zookeeping I was up to, but psychological bullying. So this talks about how, do you see how much of a distraction this is for Pi, and how he's able to distract himself by training Richard Parker? Obviously it's incredibly dangerous, but it still allows, I mean, I know we talk about Richard Parker here and what happened to him, but we have to focus on Pi being the human, and having complex thoughts, and how Richard Parker's existence really helps him. It was clear he was in a crouch and he was making to attack me. It was too late to get away, too late even to blow my whistle. So he conditions Richard Parker, when he hears the whistle, to feel the sense of nausea and seasickness. In a moment of insanity brought on by hunger, because I was more set on eating than I was staying alive, I looked Richard Parker dead in the eye. Suddenly his brute strength meant only moral weakness. It was nothing compared to the strength of my mind. I stared into his eyes, wide-eyed and defiant, and we faced off. Any zookeeper will tell you that a tiger, indeed any cat, will not attack in the face of a direct stare, but will wait until the deer, the antelope, or wild ox has turned its eyes. So here once again we see Pi's knowledge of the animal world helping him out, but also how he has this moment where it's almost testing to see whether Richard Parker has actually taken to the training, and he stares him down. For 2, perhaps 3 seconds, a terrific battle of minds for status and authority was waged between a boy and a tiger. He needed to make only the shortest of lunges to be on top of me, but I held my stare. I had won. I gasped with disbelief. So Richard Parker, is really physically strong, right? But Pi is mentally strong, and being, having rationality and being able to train Richard Parker and win this sort of situation where he is, in inverted commas, trespassed on his territory. This is, a really significant moment for Pi. He feels a great sense of relief and a sense that there is hope. From that day onwards, I felt my mastery was no longer in question, and I began to spend progressively more time on the lifeboat. I was still scared of Richard Parker, but only when it was necessary. His simple presence no longer strained me. You can get used to anything. Haven't I already said that? Isn't that what all survivors say? Now, Richard Parker also respects Pi because he was the source of food and water. My agency was pure and miraculous. It conferred power upon me. Proof. I remained alive day after day, week after week. Proof. He did not attack me, even when I was asleep on the tarpaulin. Proof. I am here to tell you the story. I had to give quickly and generously. This is talking after he catches fish. He has to feed Richard Parker very quickly, very generously. My eyes expressed longing, hurt, anguish, loneliness. All he was aware of that something stressful and momentous had happened, something beyond the outer limits of his understanding. He did not see that it was salvation barely missed. He only saw the alpha here. This odd, unpredictable tiger had been very excited. So here we talk about a moment of disappointment Pi has, and he tries to share that with Richard Parker, and he knows that Richard Parker is an animal. He doesn't understand exactly what has happened, but still, there's a sense of connection that Richard Parker has understood some aspect of what Pi is going through. I love you. The words burst out pure and unfettered, infinite. The feeling flooded my chest. Truly, I do. I love you, Richard Parker. If I didn't have you now, I don't know what I would do. I don't think I would make it. No, I wouldn't. I would die of hopelessness. Don't give up, Richard Parker. Don't give up. I'll get you to land. I promise. I promise. I mean, there's your proof for how Richard Parker kept him alive and how much Richard Parker meant to Pi. I began to imitate Richard Parker in sleeping an incredible number of hours. It wasn't proper sleep, but a state of semi-consciousness in which daydreams and reality were nearly indistinguishable. I made much use of my dream rag. So this is speaking about how Richard Parker, takes all these long breaks or like long rests because there's nothing really to do on the lifeboat, and Pi starts to mimic that. Remember, beforehand he was very much in his routine, but then he gets weaker and tireder and he starts mimicking Richard Parker in this way, and he uses his dream rag. Remember, the dream rag is like his way to sort of hallucinate and have sort of dreams to pass the time. Weak and ill-tempered, I'm so weak. If he attacks, I won't be able to defend myself. Simply do not have the energy to blow whistle. So we can see here Pi's state and how he becomes weaker and weaker. And he gets to a point where they're so weak that Pi is able to even touch Richard Parker and there's no sort of repercussions. We were slow eaters now. So do you see how as it goes from earlier, it's very much like Pi is different to Richard Parker, and then as they become weaker and weaker in the last few chapters, they become together. So now we were slow eaters. Before they used to eat their food quickly. Now they both eat slowly. So it's the sense of togetherness. They've sort of grown this connection and they're both struggling together. I came to the sad conclusion that I could no longer take care of Richard Parker. I had failed as a zookeeper. I was more affected by his imminent demise than I was by my own. But truly broken down and wasted away as I was, I could do no more for him. I closed my eyes and waited for my breath to leave my body. I muttered, "Goodbye, Richard Parker. I'm sorry for I failed you. I did my best. Farewell. Dear father, dear mother, dear Ravi, greetings. Your loving son and brother is coming to meet you. Not an hour has gone by I haven't thought of you. The moment I see you will be the happiest of my life. And now I leave matters in the hands of God, who is love and whom I love." I laughed. I knew it. I wasn't hearing voices. I hadn't gone mad. It was Richard Parker who was speaking to me. The carnivorous rascal. All this time together, he had chosen an hour before we were going to die to pipe up. I was elated to be on speaking terms with the tiger. I was certain he would turn away. He would look at me. He would flatten his ears. He would growl. In some such way, he would conclude our relationship. He did nothing of the sort. He only looked fixedly into the jungle. Then Richard Parker, companion of my torment, awful, fierce thing that kept me alive, moved forward and disappeared forever from my life. I struggled to shore and fell upon the sand. I looked about. I was truly alone, orphaned not only of my family, but now of Richard Parker, and nearly, I thought, of God. This last quote is incredibly powerful because Richard Parker's connection with Pi is very clear. And we can see that Pi is absolutely traumatized by the fact that Richard Parker doesn't even sort of acknowledge their ordeal together, and he just goes away into the jungle when they arrive in Mexico. And this is really significant because, what we said right at the beginning in the part 1 video about how Pi learns not to anthropomorphize animals, right? To see them as animals. And he recognizes this, but after spending all this time with Richard Parker and building that connection, having gone through so many things together, he's sort of in his head, he's made Richard Parker out. He talks to him, he has conversations with him to be more human than perhaps was was healthy. But at the same time, it was really important to have had Richard Parker. But Pi in the when he's in Canada and talking to the author, he's still traumatized and tormented by the fact that Richard Parker didn't even say goodbye. It's this really deep connection that he had with the tiger, and because he was the only one to really understand what he was going through. So even though Pi recognizes that Richard Parker is an animal and that he can't possibly give him the same sort of empathy and the same sort of connection or reaction that you would expect from a human connection, he still feels really deeply for him and is very traumatized by this send-off. And lastly, let's talk about the blind Frenchman. So let's go through it sort of literally in terms of what the blind Frenchman, what the interaction is all about. So the blind Frenchmen, they meet in the middle of the ocean. This is at the time where Pi is also blind from sort of being weak and starving. Please answer me, what is it? I'm blind and we have no food and water, but we have each other. That is something precious. So what is it, my dear brother? I am too blind. He wailed again. I was struck dumb. I had met another blind man on another lifeboat in the Pacific. He was close by. He was far away. He was to my left. He was to my right. He was ahead of me. He was behind me. This was a terrible cost of Richard Parker. He gave me a life, my own, but at the expense of taking one. He ripped the flesh off the man's frame and cracked his bones. The smell of blood filled my nose. Something in me died then that has never come back to life. So this talks about how they meet this blind Frenchman on a raft. He comes aboard Pi's ship and he tries to kill Pi because he's starving, and Richard Parker steps in and kills him, and Pi is traumatized by this. I found he had lied to me because the Frenchman had said that he didn't have any food. He had a little turtle meat, a dorado head, and even a supreme treat, some biscuit crumbs, and he had water. It all went into my mouth. I returned to my boat and released his. Crying as I had done, my eyes some good. Crying had done my eyes some good. The small window at the top left of my vision opened a crack. I rinsed my eyes with the seawater. With every rinsing, the window opened further. My vision came back within 2 days. I will confess that I caught one of his arms with a gaff and used his flesh as bait. I will further confess that driven by the extremity of my need and the madness which had pushed me, I ate some of his flesh. I mean small pieces, little strips that I meant for the gaff's hook that when dried by the sun looked like ordinary animal flesh. They slipped into my mouth nearly unnoticed. You must understand, my suffering was unremitting and he was already dead. I stopped as soon as I caught a fish. I pray for his soul every day. So here we can see Pi's descent into savagery. So this is a good example if you want to show that he does sort of become more animalistic, and he even eats a little bit of this man's flesh. He obviously didn't kill him, but he does eat some of the flesh. And he is able to actually see again after a couple of days. Now, this is a very sort of literal thing, so if you're answering questions on the blind Frenchman story, then that gives you an indication of the story. But in terms of figurative, to me it seems very unrealistic for him to have met an actual blind Frenchman. I feel like, in my opinion, this is a representation of something within Pi dying. And he says there's something in me died that has never come back to life. He had to give up on something in that moment, like he'd reached the lowest of all lows. He is blind in the middle of the ocean, and he had to let go of some aspect of himself in order to survive. So to me, I see this in a very figurative manner, but obviously you need to be aware of the literal as well. So it's like Pi giving up in a figurative sense. He's giving up his almost a sense of his humanity, and he's leaning into this sort of animalistic part of himself, because he's going to need that for the last push in his survival. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found the video helpful. Please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.